Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. This is volume 185 of our true crime stories for sleep. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that these stories involve real people and real tragedies. They are shared not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and help raise awareness of warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's begin tonight's first story. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolded in the working class streets of Dundalk, Maryland. A story about a beloved bar owner, a troubled marriage, and a betrayal that no one could have imagined. And this is the story of Lee Martin. In the spring of 2010, Railway Avenue in Dundalk was the kind of street where everyone knew everyone. The houses sat close together, modest homes with small yards. And at the center of it all stood a place called Hop's Inn. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't trying to be, but to the people who walked through its doors, Hop's Inn was home. The bar had been in the same family for 70 years. Generation after generation had poured drinks there, listened to stories there, created memories there. And in January of 2007, a man named Lee Martin took over the business from his relatives. His full name was Robert Lee Martin, but nobody called him Robert. To everyone who knew him, he was just Lee. Lee was 43 years old, with plans to make Hop's Inn something special. He installed central air conditioning so customers wouldn't sweat through the summer. He put in new sidewalks, brought in a pool table, mounted a large screen television on the wall. He even started a newsletter to keep his regulars updated on all the improvements. Lee had dreams of bringing back live music, of making the bar the kind of place where people wanted to gather. But more than the renovations, what people remembered about Lee was his generosity. If you came into Hop's Inn and you were short on cash, Lee would stand you a drink. If you were going through hard times, he might slip you a few dollars. On New Year's Eve, drinks were always on the house. He called all the women "sweetie" and treated his employees like family. One of those employees was a young bartender named Reo Denisik, who had worked at Hop's for 3.5 years. Rio would later say that Lee was like a father figure to him, especially after his own father passed away. They'd known each other since they were kids, and Lee had always been there. Lee lived right next door to the bar, in an apartment that shared a wall with Hop's Inn. It was convenient. After closing time, he could walk just a few steps and be home. His life revolved around that bar, around those customers, around making people feel welcome. But behind the walls of that apartment, life was not as peaceful as it seemed. Lee had been married before. He had 2 sons with his first wife, Christine, though that marriage had ended in divorce. By all accounts, Lee remained a devoted father to his boys. But in his personal life, he was searching for companionship, for connection. He found it, or thought he did, with a woman named Jacqueline. Friends called her Jay. She was younger than Lee, with flame-red hair and a troubled spirit. Jacqueline had demons she wrestled with, demons that came in bottles and pills. She struggled with alcohol. She struggled with drugs. And as time went on, those struggles began to tear at the fabric of their marriage. They had been together for 9 years by the spring of 2010, but the relationship had frayed. Neighbors on Railway Avenue often heard them arguing. The fights would echo through the walls, sharp voices cutting through the night. Those who lived nearby learned to recognize the sound of conflict coming from the apartment next to Hop's Inn. In December of 2009, Jacqueline filed a domestic violence complaint against Lee. She accused him of abusing her, claimed she needed protection, and asked the court to safeguard not just herself, but also a man she described as her best friend, a 31-year-old named David Bailey. She told the court that Lee's bank account held $500,000, that he owned property worth at least $330,000. Lee countered with his own accusations. He said Jacqueline was having an affair with her drug dealer. He said she had a serious problem with substances. He even filed for an emergency evaluation of Jacqueline, asking the court to determine whether she was mentally competent. But then something strange happened. When the court date came for Jacqueline to argue for a permanent protective order, she didn't show up. The case was dismissed. She and her daughter had moved out to live on Waldman Avenue in Edgemere, but at some point before Lee's death, they moved back into the apartment next to Hop's Inn. Police documents would later describe Jacqueline as someone who had been stealing from her husband for quite some time. The money that Lee worked so hard to earn, the money he used to buy drinks for struggling customers and improve his bar, some of it was disappearing. Jacqueline had been banned from Hop's Inn because of her excessive drinking. This was Lee's place of business. His livelihood and her behavior there had become unacceptable. But she was still living next door, still in his life, still bound to him by marriage vows that had long since lost their meaning. Behind closed doors, Jacqueline spoke of ways to be free of Lee. She mentioned pushing him down a flight of stairs. She fantasized about a life without him, a life where she could access his money, his property, his assets. And in her darkest thoughts, she began to formulate a plan. She turned to the one person she thought she could trust with such a terrible secret. Her brother. Robert Garner was 26 years old and carried his own troubled history. He had prior convictions for assault, for burglary, for theft. He was not a stranger to violence, not unfamiliar with crossing lines that most people never approach. When his sister Jacqueline came to him with a request, he did not turn her away. The plan took shape slowly, carefully. Jacqueline told Robert that she wanted Lee dead. She offered him $10,000 to do it. She gave him Lee's bank card, and Robert used it to withdraw a total of $987. With that money, he purchased a .22 caliber handgun. But Robert couldn't do this alone. He needed help. He reached out to two young men, both just 19 years old. Their names were Brandon Roth and Sturm Davis. Robert told them he needed their assistance with something, promised them money for their trouble. He told Davis he'd pay him $300. He told Roth he'd get $300 as well, though in the end Roth would only receive $100. Davis and Roth didn't fully understand what they were getting into. Davis would later tell police he thought they were just going to rough someone up, maybe rob him. He didn't know it would end in murder. Roth's job was simple: drive the getaway car, just be the wheels. Don't ask questions. As the night of May 22nd approached, the pieces were in place. Robert had the gun, he had the helpers, and Jacqueline had the access to Lee's movements. His schedule, his vulnerabilities. All they had to do was wait. Saturday, May 22nd, 2010, started like any other night at Hop's Inn. The regulars came in, ordered their drinks, watched the game on the big screen. Lee moved behind the bar, chatting with customers, making sure everyone was having a good time. This was what he loved, what he was good at. The bar's surveillance cameras captured it all, the ordinary rhythms of a Saturday night in Dundalk. People laughing, people drinking, people being human together in a neighborhood bar. But while Lee worked, a car pulled up near Railway Avenue. Inside were Robert Garner, Sturm Davis, and Brandon Roth. Robert directed Roth to park on a nearby street. Then Robert and Davis got out of the car and walked through a break in a fence, making their way to the side of Hop's Inn, to the staircase that Lee had recently built as part of his renovations. They waited in the shadows. Robert pulled out his phone and called Jacqueline. He needed to be sure, he needed to know that she really wanted this, that she was certain. Jacqueline was in her apartment next door, on her house phone. The phone records would later show that in the minutes leading up to her husband's murder, she had several conversations with her brother. They talked while he hid between her residence and the bar, while he waited to do the unthinkable. Just before Lee was about to close for the night, Jacqueline called him at the bar. It was a timing call, making sure everything was coordinated. Then she called Robert back. The trap was set. At approximately 2:20 in the morning, Lee Martin locked the doors of Hop's Inn. It had been a good night, nothing unusual, nothing to worry about. He stepped out into the darkness of Railway Avenue, ready to walk the few steps to his home and call it a night. Robert Garner emerged from his hiding place. Davis was with him. Robert approached Lee, and his hand went to the gun tucked in his waistband. He demanded money. Lee appeared frightened, confused. This wasn't how things were supposed to be on his street, at his bar. He said he didn't have any money. Robert pulled out the gun. Lee, seeing the weapon, reached for his wallet, handed over what cash he had. Maybe he thought that would be enough. Maybe he thought they'd take it and leave. Robert started shooting. The bullets tore through Lee's head, his neck, his chest. The sound echoed down Railway Avenue, sharp cracks that shattered the quiet of the early morning. Lee fell to the ground in front of his home. The place he'd worked so hard to improve. The place where he'd shown so much kindness to so many people. Inside the Railway Inn, a bar a block away, someone heard the shots. 3 of them, distinct and unmistakable. They turned to others and said, "Something must have happened at Hops." Robert and Davis ran back through the break in the fence. Roth was waiting in the car, and he heard the gunshots from where he sat. 8 shots in total, though he couldn't have known the exact number in the chaos of the moment. The 3 of them sped away into the night. Witnesses called 911. At about 2:25 in the morning, a man had been shot in the head. 2 males had been seen running from the scene. When police and paramedics arrived, they found Lee Martin lying in front of his home. He had been shot not 8 times, but 9 times. He was still alive, barely clinging to consciousness. They rushed him to Bayview Medical Center, but the damage was too severe, the wounds too catastrophic. Lee Martin was pronounced dead. A helicopter flew over Dundalk that night, its spotlight sweeping across every street, searching for the killers. Neighbors looked out their windows, wondering what had happened, feeling fear creep into a community that had always felt safe. On Railway Avenue, the owner of Hops Inn was gone, and the mystery of who had killed him and why had only just begun. Baltimore County Police had little to go on at first. The surveillance cameras at Hops Inn had captured part of the crime, showing 2 men hiding under the staircase Lee had built, waiting for him. But identifying them would take time. Neighbors were interviewed. Employees were questioned. Friends tried to make sense of the senseless. Everyone described Lee the same way. Generous, kind, someone who'd give you his last dollar if you needed it. Who would want to hurt him? The police kept coming back to one detail. The attack seemed planned, coordinated. It looked like a hit. And in cases like that, you look close to home. 4 days after Lee's murder, on Wednesday, May 26th, Baltimore County Police made their move. They arrested 4 people in connection with the shooting, and the name that shocked everyone was the first one announced. Jacqueline Martin, Lee's wife, the woman he'd lived next door to, the woman he'd been married to for 9 years. She was charged with first-degree murder. Also arrested were her brother, Robert Garner, identified as the shooter, and 2 19-year-olds, Sturm Riley Davis and Brandon Michael Roth, identified as accomplices. The police chief held a press conference and made it clear that Jacqueline Martin had orchestrated and arranged the murder with her brother and other associates. She was the architect of this horror. When Davis was questioned, he confessed to arriving at Hops Inn to help Robert Garner beat up Lee Martin. He said Robert displayed a handgun and demanded Lee's wallet. When Lee handed over cash, Robert started shooting. Davis said he ran with Robert to the car where Roth was waiting, and they fled. Davis said he was supposed to get $300 for his help. Riff admitted that he drove the 2 other men to the bar so that Robert could deal with someone. From the car, he heard 8 gunshots. He said he got $100 for driving. When police first questioned Jacqueline, she claimed she had been asleep at the time of the shooting. But phone records told a different story. They showed that she was on her house phone during the minutes leading up to her husband's murder. That she had several conversations with Robert while he was hiding between her residence and the bar, waiting to shoot and kill Lee. The phone records showed that just before the shooting, Jacqueline called her husband at the bar, and then she called her brother back. She had coordinated the whole thing. She had given Robert money to buy the gun. She had made sure Lee would step out at the right time into the waiting ambush. Friends of Lee weren't entirely surprised when they heard Jacqueline had been arrested. Debbie Kierans, one of Lee's friends, said that everyone sort of had a feeling she had some involvement in it because everybody was saying it looked like a hit. The charging documents revealed the depth of Jacqueline's betrayal. Police said she had been stealing from Lee for some time. She had a drug and alcohol problem, and prosecutors believed her motive was money. She thought that when Lee died, she would receive a portion of his assets, his bank account with $500,000, his property worth hundreds of thousands more. All 4 suspects were charged with first-degree murder and held at the Baltimore County Detention Center with bail denied. Lee Martin was laid to rest at Comley Funeral Home on Sawyers Point Road in Dundalk. The visitation was on a Tuesday afternoon, from 2 until 5. The funeral service was held at 7 that evening. His friends, his employees, his regulars from Hops Inn, they all came to say goodbye to a man who had been like family to so many of them. And as they mourned, the wheels of justice began to turn. The case wound its way through the legal system over the next 2 years. One by one, the defendants entered their pleas and faced their sentencing. In October of 2010, Brandon Roth, the getaway driver, pleaded guilty to first-degree assault. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison with all but 7 years suspended. He would serve 7 years for his role in Lee's death. The following month, Sturm Davis pleaded guilty to armed robbery and the use of a handgun in the commission of a crime of violence. He was sentenced to 30 years with all but 10 years suspended. He would serve 10 years. Davis maintained that he thought they were only going to rob Lee, not kill him. But that didn't absolve him of responsibility for being there, for participating in the ambush that ended a man's life. In November of 2011, Robert Garner pleaded guilty to first-degree murder before Judge Robert E. Cahill, Jr. He admitted that his sister Jacqueline had planned the whole thing. He admitted that she approached him, offered him money, gave him her husband's bank card to buy the gun. He admitted pulling the trigger 8 times, shooting his brother-in-law in the head, neck, and chest. In March of 2012, Robert Garner was sentenced to 60 years in prison. He was 28 years old at sentencing. He would not be eligible for parole until he was an old man, if he lived that long, which left only Jacqueline. On Friday, January 13th, 2012, Jacqueline Martin appeared in Baltimore County Circuit Court. She was 31 years old, wearing a loose-fitting black suit, shackles around her ankles. She entered what's called an Alford plea to the charge of first-degree murder. An Alford plea is a strange thing. It means the defendant maintains their innocence, but acknowledges that prosecutors have enough evidence to obtain a conviction. Jacqueline never admitted guilt, never said the words, "I did this," but she acknowledged the overwhelming evidence against her. During the hearing, prosecutor Lisa Dever read a statement detailing the evidence from the case. She explained how Jacqueline had been banned from Hops Inn because of her excessive drinking. She revealed that Jacqueline had mentioned pushing Lee down a flight of stairs as a possible way to kill him, showing that she'd been contemplating his death for some time. Dever explained that Jacqueline's defense attorneys claimed she was a victim of domestic violence, that Lee had abused her, but prosecutors believed her motive was money. Pure and simple, she wanted access to Lee's assets, and she was willing to have him killed to get them. Judge Cahill and Jacqueline's attorney, James Rhodes, asked her repeatedly if she understood the terms of the plea agreement. Over and over she answered, yes. Under the agreement, she could be sentenced to up to 60 years in prison with the possibility of parole. If the case had gone to trial and she'd been convicted, she could have faced life without parole. The sentencing was scheduled for April. On Monday, April 16th, 2012, Jacqueline Martin stood before Judge Cahill once more. The courtroom was filled with people whose lives had been touched by this tragedy. Lee's friends, his employees, people from the neighborhood who couldn't understand how someone could orchestrate the murder of a man who'd been so kind. Baltimore County State's Attorney Scott Schellenberger addressed the court. He said that while they always want to punish the shooter the most, in this case, Jacqueline started the ball rolling. Robert Garner had no independent reason to kill Lee Martin, except for her request for him to do so. She was the architect, the planner, the one who set everything in motion. Schellenberger said he didn't care if Jacqueline could admit it to herself or not. They'd gotten the ultimate sentence they thought was appropriate. Judge Cahill sentenced Jacqueline Martin to 60 years in prison. She was 31 years old. If she served her full sentence, she would be 91 when she was released. An old woman who had spent the majority of her life behind bars. As she was led away in shackles, the courtroom sat in heavy silence. Justice had been served, but it felt hollow. Lee Martin was still dead. His boys had lost their father. His friends had lost someone they cared about. Hitson had closed its doors, its future uncertain. The bar that had been in Lee's family for 70 years. The place where he'd worked so hard to create something special. It was empty now. The lights were off. The pool table sat unused. The large screen television displayed nothing but darkness. In the years that followed, people in Dundalk still talked about Lee Martin. They remembered his generosity, his warmth, the way he made everyone feel welcome. They remembered New Year's Eves when drinks were on the house. Remembered times when he'd lent them money or bought them around when they were short on cash. Rayo Daniak, the young bartender who'd looked up to Lee like a father, carried the loss with him. He spoke of Lee in interviews, his voice breaking, saying that any time he needed anything, Lee had taken care of him. Lee had been family since they were little kids. Others in the neighborhood would pass by the closed doors of Hop's Inn and feel a pang of sadness. That bar had been a gathering place, a piece of Dundalk's history, and now it was just a building with memories locked inside. The case bore an eerie similarity to another murder that had happened in Baltimore County just 2 months before Lee's death. In March of 2010, a man named William Porter was killed at a gas station he owned on East Joppa Road in Towson. His wife and 5 others were charged with his murder. The parallels were impossible to ignore. A business owner killed in what looked like a robbery. A wife who'd orchestrated the whole thing. Family members willing to pull the trigger. Police Chief James Johnson mentioned the similarities during the investigation, noting that technology had helped in both cases. Surveillance cameras, phone records, the digital trails we leave behind. They all helped piece together what had happened, but knowing what happened doesn't make it easier to accept. It doesn't bring Lee back. It doesn't undo the betrayal of a wife who looked at her husband and saw him not a partner but an obstacle. A source of money, something to be eliminated. Jacqueline Martin sits in prison today. By the time you hear this story, she's been there for many years. She has many years left to go. Whether she's found any remorse, any recognition of what she did, we don't know. That's between her and her conscience. Robert Garner is also in prison, serving his 60-year sentence alongside his sister. The two people who shared blood and shared guilt, separated by prison walls, but bound by the terrible thing they did together. Brendan Roth has been released by now, having served his 7 years. Sturm Davis may also be out, having served his 10. So they were young when they made their terrible choice. Barely more than teenagers. They carry with them the knowledge that they were part of something that destroyed a good man's life, that left a community mourning, that closed a bar that had stood for 70 years. As you lie here in the darkness, listening to this story, perhaps you're thinking about the choices we make, the small decisions that ripple outward, touching lives we never intended to touch. The moment when someone chooses darkness over light, violence over peace, betrayal over loyalty. Lee Martin chose to be generous. He chose to help people. He chose to stand drinks for those who couldn't pay, to loan money to those in need, to make his bar a place of welcome. Those choices made him beloved. They also made him vulnerable. Jacqueline Martin chose differently. She chose addiction over sobriety. She chose theft over honesty. She chose murder over whatever other options might have been available to her. Those choices led to a courtroom, to shackles, to 6 decades behind bars. We all make choices. Some are small, barely noticeable. Some are enormous, life-altering, irreversible. And once we've made them, we have to live with the consequences. For better or for worse, on Railway Avenue in Dundalk, the houses still sit close together. The street still looks much the same. But where Hop's Inn once stood, where music played and friends gathered and a generous man worked hard to make something special, there's only absence now. The building remains, but the spirit is gone. The place where you could get a free drink on New Year's Eve, where you could borrow a few bucks if times were hard, where someone called you sweetie and treated you like family. That place exists only in memory now. Lee Martin deserved better. He deserved to live out his days improving his bar, serving his customers, being a father to his sons. He deserved loyalty from the woman he'd married, protection from the family he'd welcomed into his life. He deserved to grow old, to see his dreams for Hop's Inn come to fruition. Instead, he got betrayal. He got bullets in the darkness. He got a grave in Dundalk while those who killed him went to prison. Justice was served, as much as it can be, in cases like this. But justice doesn't resurrect the dead. It doesn't reopen the bar. It doesn't undo the trauma inflicted on everyone who loved Lee Martin. What it does is create a record, a statement that this was wrong. that there are consequences, that a life mattered, and its taking will be answered for. And so Jacqueline Martin sits in prison, day after day, year after year. The flame-red hair has likely gone gray by now. The woman who thought she could orchestrate a murder and walk away with money and freedom. She learned that some choices carry weights too heavy to ever put down. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we're going to explore a story, one that happened on a quiet November morning in Indianapolis. It's a story about faith, about tragedy, and about the unpredictable nature of violence. Let your breathing slow. There's nowhere you need to be. Just listen. And this is the story of Amanda Blackburn. The morning of November 10th, 2015, began like so many others on Sunnyfield Court, a peaceful residential street on the northwest side of Indianapolis. The houses sat quiet in the pre-dawn darkness. Inside one of them, a young family was just beginning to stir. Amanda Grace Blackburn had always been a woman of deep conviction. Born on July 31st, 1987, in Muskin, Michigan, she grew up in a household where faith was the foundation of everything. Her parents, Phil and Robin Byers, raised Amanda alongside her siblings, James and Amber, in a home filled with warmth and Christian values. When Amanda was 8 years old, the family moved to Elkhart, Indiana, where her father served as pastor of the First Baptist Church. Amanda was the kind of child who seemed to glow from within. She was bright, dedicated, and deeply compassionate. She attended Elkhart Christian Academy, where she excelled academically and socially. Those who knew her remembered a girl who was always bringing people together, always seeking to lift others up. After graduating in 2006, she enrolled at Pensacola Christian College in Finnedy, where she earned her associate's degree in 2008. That same year, on August 1st, Amanda married Davy Blackburn. They had met during their college years, two young people united by their shared faith and their desire to serve others. Davy was training to become a pastor, and Amanda supported his calling wholeheartedly. Together they envisioned a life dedicated to ministry, to building communities, to helping people find purpose and hope. For several years the young couple lived in South Carolina, where Davy worked as an assistant pastor at New Spring Church. But they felt called to do more. In 2012, they made a bold decision. They packed up their belongings and moved to Indianapolis with a mission: to plant a new church from the ground up. Resonate Church began with just a small congregation, around 150 people, meeting in whatever space they could find. But under Davy and Amanda's leadership, it started to grow. Amanda threw herself into the work with characteristic passion. She wasn't content to simply attend services. She wanted to make a real difference in the community. She became deeply involved with Fordindy, an organization dedicated to helping those affected by poverty. She spent hours working with families, listening to their struggles, offering support and encouragement. Those who knew Amanda at Resonate Church remembered her warmth, her authenticity, her genuine care for others. She was all about people coming to know Jesus, one church member would later say. That's who she was as a person. You could see it in her family life, in her personal life, and in her church life. In 2014, Amanda and Davy welcomed their first child, a son they named Weston James Blackburn. Amanda embraced motherhood with the same devotion she brought to everything else in her life. She was a hands-on mother, patient and loving, determined to raise her son with the same values her parents had instilled in her. By the fall of 2015, the Blackburn family had even more reason to celebrate. Amanda was 12 weeks pregnant with their second child, a daughter they had already named Everett Grace, Evie for short. They had recently shared the news with their congregation, and the response had been joyful. Everything seemed to be falling into place for this young family. Their church was thriving, their marriage was strong, and their future looked bright. But on the morning of November 10th, everything would change. To understand what happened to Amanda Blackburn, we need to step back and look at the broader picture of what was unfolding in Indianapolis during those early November days. Three young men, Larry Joe Taylor Jr., 18 years old, Jalen Watson, 21, and Deano Gordon, 24, had known each other for some time. They moved in similar circles, lived in the same neighborhoods, and shared a growing desperation for money. On November 3rd, 2015, a week before Amanda's death, Taylor and Watson broke into an apartment at the Westlake Apartments complex. It was around 10 o'clock at night when they forced their way into a 21-year-old woman's home. She was alone, taking a shower when she heard the sound of her front door being kicked in. The two men ordered her out of the shower and forced her to lie on her bedroom floor. What happened next was an act of brutal violence. Taylor, armed with a handgun, sexually assaulted the woman while Watson searched through her belongings. Several times, Watson returned to the bedroom and told Taylor to stop, saying that's not what we're here for. But Taylor continued. Eventually, they forced the woman to unlock her phone and computer, demanded her bank cards, and fled with cash and electronics. This wasn't their first crime, and it wouldn't be their last. On November 9th, the day before Amanda's death, Taylor was allegedly involved in another violent incident. Rolando Gonzalez Hernandez, a 27-year-old man, was found shot to death in a parking lot at the La Jolla apartment complex. His body lay next to his car. Police would later charge Taylor with his murder as well. Though this case wouldn't come to light until later, the violence was escalating. Taylor, in particular, seemed to be spiraling into increasingly reckless and brutal behavior. And on the morning of November 10th, that violence would reach its most devastating point. Darkness still covered Indianapolis when Davy Blackburn woke up at around 4:30 in the morning on November 10th. This was his routine. He liked to get to the gym early, before the day really began. Amanda and their 16-month-old son Weston were still sleeping as he quietly gathered his things. The front door clicked shut behind him shortly after 6 a.m. The neighborhood was silent. Most people were still in bed, their houses dark. Davy climbed into his car and drove away, heading to LA Fitness to work out. He had no idea that someone was watching. In the pre-dawn hours, Larry Taylor, Jalen Watson, and Deano Gordon were already out, prowling through the neighborhoods of northwest Indianapolis. They had been awake for hours, looking for opportunities, for houses to rob, for easy money. Their first target that morning was an apartment several miles away from Sunnyfield Court. They broke in while the occupant was sleeping, moving through the rooms quietly, taking what they could find: an iPhone from a bedroom, car keys, a laptop, a wallet. As they were leaving, they discovered something troubling. The house had a security camera, and it had recorded them. According to later testimony, Taylor's response was immediate and chilling. He wanted to go back inside and kill the sleeping occupant to eliminate the witness who might identify them. Watson and Gordon talked him down, convinced him to leave, but the suggestion itself revealed something dark about Taylor's state of mind. He was willing to kill to avoid getting caught. They moved on to a second house, loading their stolen items into a car they had previously taken. At this second location, they stole televisions and a laptop, carrying them out and piling them into the vehicle. By now, they had committed multiple burglaries. But they weren't satisfied. They wanted more. That's when they noticed Davy Blackburn leaving his house on Sunnyfield Court. The three men watched as Davy got into his car and drove away. The house looked quiet. The lights were off. It seemed like an easy target, possibly empty, and even if someone was home, they would be asleep and vulnerable. They made their decision. They would hit one more house. The front door was unlocked. Davy had left it that way when he departed for the gym. A small oversight that would have devastating consequences. Larry Taylor, Jalen Watson, and Deano Gordon entered the house quietly. The living room was dim, with the early morning light just beginning to filter through the windows. A Christmas tree stood in one corner, its lights off. The house had the peaceful stillness of a family home at rest. But the house wasn't empty. Amanda was there, and so was little Weston, still sleeping in his crib upstairs. What happened next is pieced together from testimony given years later during the trial, from the accounts of Watson and Gordon, who would eventually cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences. According to their testimony, when the three men encountered Amanda, the situation quickly escalated. They found cash in a billfold and split it among themselves. They took a credit card. Then they realized that if they could get Amanda's PIN number, they could withdraw more money from ATMs. But Amanda refused to cooperate. She dropped to the floor, refusing to leave her house, refusing to abandon her sleeping son. Watson and Gordon made a decision. They would leave and go find ATMs, try to use the credit card they had taken. They would leave Taylor behind to keep watch over Amanda and Weston. Taylor was armed with a .38 caliber revolver. The two men left, taking the stolen car and driving away in search of cash machines. They tried the first ATM, but the transaction failed. They drove to a second location. This time, Watson wrapped a pink sweater they had stolen from an earlier burglary around his face to conceal his identity. He successfully withdrew $400 from Amanda's account. The timestamp on the transaction was 6:53 a.m. Meanwhile, back at the Blackburn house, Larry Taylor was alone with Amanda and her toddler son. What happened during those minutes when Watson and Gordon were gone would remain a source of horror and grief for years to come. According to testimony, Taylor struck Amanda in the mouth with his gun. Then, according to what he would later tell his accomplices, he attempted to sexually assault her. Amanda, 12 weeks pregnant and desperate to protect herself and her child, resisted. Taylor shot her. The first bullet struck her in the upper body. But he didn't stop there. As Amanda lay on the floor, wounded and helpless, Taylor leaned over her and fired again, this time shooting her in the back of the head. Then, according to what he would later tell Watson and Gordon, he leaned even closer, looked at her face and watched her bleed. Weston remained in his crib throughout the attack, miraculously unharmed. When Watson and Gordon returned to pick up Taylor, they noticed he seemed different, agitated perhaps, or strangely calm. As they drove away from the neighborhood, Taylor casually told them what he had done. "I smoked her," he said. At first, Gordon didn't believe him, but as Taylor continued to talk, describing in detail how Amanda had charged at him and how he had shot her to avoid being scratched, the truth became impossible to deny. Watson was stunned. He had wanted quick cash from burglaries. He had never imagined that anyone would get hurt, much less murdered. But it was too late. Amanda Blackburn lay dying on her living room floor, her blood pooling around her, her unborn daughter dying with her. Davy Blackburn finished his workout and left the gym around 7:30 that morning. He got into his car and started the drive home, his mind on the day ahead, on his wife and son waiting for him. But when he pulled into his driveway, he didn't immediately go inside. He was on the phone with a friend, and he didn't want the conversation to wake Amanda or Weston. So he stayed in his car, sitting in the driveway, talking quietly. The minutes ticked by. 15 minutes. Half an hour. 45 minutes. It wasn't until after 8 a.m. that Davy finally ended his call and walked toward his front door. The house was quiet. When he stepped inside, too quiet, perhaps. He called out for Amanda, but got no response. He moved through the entryway into the living room, and that's when he saw her. Amanda was lying face down on the floor near the fireplace and the Christmas tree. She was nude from the waist down. She wasn't moving. Blood surrounded her. Davy's world shattered in that instant. He rushed to her side, calling her name, trying to understand what had happened. When she didn't respond, he grabbed his phone and dialed 911, his voice breaking as he tried to explain to the dispatcher what he was seeing. "My wife, she's on the floor, there's blood everywhere. I don't know what happened. Please, you have to send help." Paramedics arrived within minutes. They found Amanda unresponsive, barely clinging to life. She had suffered multiple gunshot wounds to her head, her back, her arm. The injuries were severe, catastrophic. They rushed her to the hospital, but the prognosis was grim. Upstairs, little Weston was still in his crib, unharmed but alone. Someone, likely one of the first responders, went up and got him, lifting him out of his bed and carrying him away from the scene of horror below. Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department officers swarmed the Blackburn home within minutes of Davy's call. The scene they found was one of shocking brutality. Amanda's blood stained the living room floor. Items were missing: Credit cards, cash, possibly other valuables. The front door had been left unlocked. Detectives immediately began canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual that morning. That's when they learned about the other burglaries. 2 other homes on or near Sunnyfield Court had been broken into that same morning. Televisions had been stolen. Electronics, a car. The pattern was clear. Someone had been prowling through the neighborhood, looking for easy targets. Investigators also reviewed security footage from neighbors' homes, hoping to catch a glimpse of the perpetrators. They examined the timeline carefully. Davy had left the house at 6 a.m. Amanda had been found at around 8:15 a.m. That meant the attack had happened sometime in that 2-hour and 15-minute window. Davy himself was quickly cleared as a suspect. Security footage from LA Fitness confirmed he had been at the gym during the critical time period. Phone records showed he had been on a call with a friend when he arrived home. There was no evidence whatsoever linking him to the crime, but Amanda's condition was deteriorating rapidly. At the hospital, doctors fought to save her life, but the damage was too severe. The gunshot wound to the back of her head had caused massive trauma. She remained unconscious, on life support. Her family gathered around her bedside. On November 11, 2015, just 24 hours after she was shot, Amanda Grace Blackburn died. She was 28 years old. Her unborn daughter Evie died with her. The investigation intensified. Detectives knew they were looking for multiple suspects, likely 3 based on the pattern of burglaries. They processed the evidence meticulously. DNA samples, fingerprints, items left behind at the various crime scenes. And then they got a break. The pink sweater became the key piece of evidence. During the second burglary that morning, before the attack on Amanda, the 3 men had stolen a pink sweater along with other items. When Watson later used that same sweater to cover his face while withdrawing money from Amanda's bank account at the ATM, he left behind DNA evidence on the fabric. Forensic analysis matched the DNA to Jalen Watson. The identification was solid, indisputable. From there, investigators were able to trace connections to Larry Taylor and Deano Gordon. Cell phone records placed all 3 men in the area of the burglaries at the relevant times. Bank records showed the ATM withdrawal using Amanda's card. Surveillance footage from the ATMs captured images of the suspects, though their faces were partially obscured. On November 20th, 2015, 10 days after Amanda's death, police arrested all 3 men. Larry Joe Taylor Jr. was taken into custody at his cousin's house on North Meridian Street. When officers arrived, they found him there along with a cell phone that would later be tied to the crimes. Jalen Watson and Deano Gordon were also arrested that same day. The charges were severe. Taylor and Watson were both charged with murder, along with multiple counts of burglary, robbery, theft, auto theft, and other related offenses. Gordon faced burglary and related charges but was not initially charged with murder, apparently because evidence suggested he had not entered the Blackburn home during the actual attack. When Davy Blackburn learned of the arrests, he released a statement that reflected both his grief and his faith. "I am extremely relieved," he wrote. "Though everything inside of me wants to hate, be angry, and slip into despair, I choose the route of forgiveness, grace, and hope. If there is one thing I've learned from Amanda in the 10 years we were together, it's this, that Jesus would give me and our family a heart of forgiveness." It was a remarkable statement, one that spoke to the values Amanda herself had lived by. The path to justice in Amanda Blackburn's case would prove to be long and complicated, marked by delays, legal maneuvering, and multiple failed attempts at trial. In November 2015, when Taylor and Watson made their first court appearance, both entered pleas of not guilty. The Marion County Prosecutor's Office announced they would consider seeking the death penalty given the severity of the crimes and the aggravating factors. Amanda's pregnancy, the sexual assault, the brutality of the attack. But as the case moved forward, the 2 accomplices began to reconsider their positions. In October 2017, nearly 2 years after the murder, Jalen Watson made a decision. He agreed to plead guilty to 1 count of robbery and 2 counts of burglary in exchange for having his other charges, including murder, dismissed. The condition was clear: he had to cooperate fully with prosecutors in their case against Larry Taylor and Deano Gordon. He had to testify about what happened that morning. Watson's sentencing was delayed for years, dependent on his cooperation and testimony. In 2018, Gianno Gordon reached a similar plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of burglary and robbery, resulting in serious bodily injury. Like Watson, he agreed to testify against Taylor, but bringing Larry Taylor to trial proved extraordinarily difficult. The first attempt at a trial ended in a mistrial when a juror revealed she had prior knowledge of the case and had lied during jury selection about her awareness of it. The trial had to be thrown out and rescheduled. The second attempt also ended in a mistrial, this time because a juror learned about Amanda's pregnancy information that had been kept from the jury because the judge feared it would prejudice them and make it impossible for Taylor to receive a fair trial. Then came the COVID-19 pandemic, which delayed court proceedings across the country for months and even years. There were also changes in attorneys, disputes over evidence, and countless legal motions filed by both sides. It wasn't until September 2022, nearly 7 years after Amanda's death, that Larry Taylor finally faced trial for her murder. By that point, the case had been changed from a jury trial to a bench trial, meaning a judge alone would hear the evidence and render a verdict. Judge Grant Hawkins would preside. The trial began on September 19, 2022, in a Marion County courtroom. The prosecution's case was built on a combination of physical evidence, testimony from Watson and Gordon, cell phone records, bank records, and DNA analysis. Jalen Watson took the stand first. He described the events of that morning in November 2015. The burglaries, the stolen car, the decision to target the Blackburn home. He testified that when they encountered Amanda inside the house, they found cash and took a credit card. He said that when Amanda refused to leave the house or cooperate, he and Gordon decided to leave and try to use the card at ATMs. He testified that Taylor stayed behind with Amanda and Weston. When Watson and Gordon returned after successfully withdrawing money from the second ATM, Taylor was waiting for them in the neighborhood. Watson testified that Taylor told them he had tried to have sex with Amanda and when she refused, he shot her. "I was stunned," Watson told the court. "I just wanted quick cash. I would never want anyone to get hurt or even be in homes they burglarized. I would never commit a sexual crime." Gianno Gordon's testimony corroborated Watson's account. He testified that when they picked up Taylor, Taylor said, "I smoked her." Gordon said he initially didn't believe Taylor. But in a later conversation with a group of people, Taylor described in more detail how Amanda had charged at him and how he had shot her in the head. By that point, having seen news reports about the murder, Gordon knew Taylor was telling the truth. Both men admitted to initially lying to police about their involvement. Watson said Taylor had sent him a threatening text message telling him to keep his mouth shut or else. The defense argued that there was reasonable doubt about who had possession of the phones, about where calls were made from, about the reliability of the cooperating witnesses who had obvious reasons to minimize their own involvement, and blamed Taylor. But the physical evidence was damning. The DNA on the pink sweater, the ATM footage, the cell phone records, the testimony from 2 accomplices who had everything to lose by lying, since their own plea deals depended on truthful testimony. Davy Blackburn also took the stand. He described the morning of November 10th, his routine of going to the gym early, his phone conversation in the driveway, the horrifying moment when he walked inside and found his wife dying on the floor. "We lost everything and more," he told the court. Amanda's sister and father also gave statements describing the woman they had loved, the gaping hole her death had left in their lives. On September 22, 2022, Judge Grant Hawkins announced his verdict. Larry Joe Taylor Jr. was found guilty of murder. He was also found guilty of multiple counts of burglary, theft, criminal confinement, and carrying a handgun without a license. He was acquitted on some charges, including robbery, but the murder conviction was solid. "We are pleased with today's verdict, and that we are finally able to bring justice for Amanda and her family," said Marion County Prosecutor Ryan Mears in a statement. "I commend the Blackburn family and the community for the tremendous amount of patience and grace they have shown throughout this process." On October 14th, 2022, Larry Taylor returned to court for sentencing. Before Judge Hawkins handed down the sentence, he heard from the victims from Davy Blackburn, from Amanda's father and sister, and from the 2 other burglary victims whose homes had been invaded that same morning. Amanda's family spoke of their loss, of the woman she had been, of the future that had been stolen from them all. But remarkably, they also spoke of forgiveness. "Despite being angry, we offer you forgiveness," they told Taylor. "We encourage you to be more like Amanda was." Davy Blackburn called the crimes selfish and demonic, but he also emphasized the Christian principle of forgiveness that had been so central to Amanda's life. Judge Hawkins sentenced Larry Taylor to 86 years in the Indiana Department of Correction. The sentence reflected the murder charge as well as the additional burglary and theft charges. Given Taylor's age at the time of the crime, 18, the sentence meant he would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. Taylor attempted to appeal his conviction, arguing that police had questioned him about his cell phone before reading him his Miranda rights, and that those statements should have been excluded from trial. But the Indiana Court of Appeals denied his appeal in November 2023, ruling that the statements had never been admitted at trial anyway, and that even if they had been, there was overwhelming evidence of his guilt beyond those statements. But the legal proceedings weren't quite over yet. In November 2022, Larry Taylor pleaded guilty to an additional charge: the sexual assault of the woman at the Westlake Apartments on November 3rd, 2015, 1 week before Amanda's murder. He received an additional 20-year sentence to be served consecutively to his existing 86-year sentence. That meant Larry Taylor's total sentence was 106 years in prison. Jalen Watson, who had cooperated with prosecutors and testified against Taylor, had his sentence modified. Originally sentenced to 29 years, 14 years of that sentence were later suspended. After the revision, he was ordered to serve 10 years in prison plus 5 years of home detention. Deano Gordon was sentenced to 25 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation for his role in the burglaries and for his cooperation in the case against Taylor. As of today, Larry Taylor is serving his sentence at the Miami Correctional Facility in Bunker Hill, Indiana. Jalen Watson has reportedly been released from prison and is under home detention. The story of Amanda Blackburn's murder is one that shook Indianapolis and captured national attention. It was a story of randomness and cruelty, of a young mother murdered in her own home, of a family shattered by senseless violence. But it's also a story about faith, about forgiveness, about the choice to find meaning even in the darkest tragedy. In the days and weeks after Amanda's death, her memorial service drew more than 2,000 people. They came to honor a woman who had devoted her life to serving others, to helping people find hope and purpose. They came to grieve, to remember, and to celebrate the impact she had made in her 28 years of life. Davy Blackburn faced an unimaginable loss. He had lost not just his wife, but also his unborn daughter. He was left to raise his young son, Weston, alone, to navigate a future that looked nothing like what he had imagined. But he chose to honor Amanda's memory by continuing the work she had cared so deeply about. In the years after Amanda's death, Davy started a ministry focused on intercepting young people in inner-city Indianapolis before they could fall into lives of crime and violence. Kids like the ones who had killed his wife. It was an act of remarkable grace, an attempt to break the cycle of violence rather than simply condemn it. He later remarried a woman named Christy, who shared his faith and his commitment to serving others. Together they continued the work Amanda had started, seeking to help those who were hurting, to offer hope to those in despair. Amanda's family established the Amanda Byers Blackburn Legacy Fund through the Community Foundation of Elkhart County. The fund supports causes Amanda cared about, helping people connect, creating spaces for community, making meaningful transformations for those suffering from disabilities or facing difficult circumstances. There was even talk of developing a park in her memory, a place where children could play and parents could gather, a living testament to the light she had brought into the world. Amanda loved to bring people together to believe in Jesus, her father said. Therefore, if we invest in the kingdom, we can continue to make an impact in Amanda's name. The tragedy of Amanda Blackburn's murder raises uncomfortable questions. How do we make sense of such random violence? How do we reconcile the existence of evil with our beliefs about justice, about goodness, about the way the world should work? There are no easy answers to these questions. Amanda was a woman who dedicated her life to helping others, who embodied kindness and compassion, who was building a future for her family. She didn't deserve what happened to her. No one does. Larry Taylor was a young man, just 18 years old when he committed these crimes. But his youth doesn't excuse the choices he made, the violence he enacted, the lives he destroyed. He had agency, he had choice, and he chose cruelty. The justice system did its work, however imperfectly, however slowly. Taylor was convicted, sentenced, and removed from society. But even the longest prison sentence can't undo what was done. Amanda is still gone. Evie was never born. Weston grew up without his mother. Davy's life was forever altered. In the end, perhaps the only meaning to be found in this tragedy is the meaning we create from it. The choice to forgive rather than hate. The choice to build rather than destroy. The choice to honor a life by continuing the work that life represented. Amanda made it her mission to see as many people as possible come to know hope, to feel loved, to find purpose. Her family and friends have chosen to carry that mission forward, to ensure that her story doesn't end with violence, but continues through the lives she touched and the legacy she left behind. As you lie here tonight, warm and safe in your bed, think about the fragility of life. Think about the people you love, the moments you share, the ordinary days that string together to create a life. Amanda Blackburn lived 28 years. She was a daughter, a sister, a wife, a mother. She was a friend to many, a helper to those in need. She filled her days with purpose and meaning. She loved deeply and was deeply loved in return. Her story is a reminder that we never truly know how much time we have, that every morning we wake up is a gift, that the people we love deserve to know they are loved. It's also a reminder of the darkness that exists in the world, of the capacity for cruelty that some people carry within them. We cannot always protect ourselves or those we love from that darkness, but we can choose how we respond to it. We can choose to meet hatred with love, violence with peace, despair with hope. That was Amanda's way, and in their grief, her family and friends chose to honor that way. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, I want to tell you about a story from the heartland of America, from a small farming town, where everyone knew everyone, where life moved at the pace of the seasons, and where one family's tragedy would eventually reveal a truth that no one wanted to believe. And this is the story of Ryan Cooper. There's something about the Iowa countryside that feels timeless. The way the cornfields stretch out like an ocean of green in the summer. The way the wind carries the scent of earth and growing things. In Tama County, in a little town called Traer, population just over 1,600. This is the kind of place where generations stay put, where sons inherit their father's land, and where the sound of a tractor in the early morning is as familiar as birdsong. This is where Ryan Roy Cooper was born on the 1st of June, 1979. His parents Jan and Connie Cooper brought him into a world that revolved around family and farming. They already had 2 sons, Jason and Aaron, and later they'd welcome Ryan's younger sister, Michelle. The Coopers were farmers through and through. Jan's father had worked that land, and his father before him. It was a legacy written in soil and sweat. But before Ryan ever took his first breath, the Cooper family knew tragedy. Just a year before Ryan was born, in January of 1978, his older brother Jason passed away at just 5 years old. Complications from heart surgery taking him far too soon. The family carried that loss with them, the way families do, folding the grief into the fabric of their daily lives, finding ways to keep moving forward. Ryan grew up in that shadow, but also in the light of a close-knit family that loved fiercely. From the time he could walk, you'd find him in rubber boots too big for his feet, following his dad around the farm, playing with toy tractors on the living room floor, already dreaming of the day he'd work that land for real. His sister Michelle would later remember how even as a little boy, Ryan had this quiet determination about him, this certainty that he was meant to be a farmer. He went to North Tama High School right there in Traer, graduating in 1998. And then just like he'd always planned, he joined the family farm. Cooper Farms became his life, his identity, his pride. He worked as a cattle producer, a farmer, a truck driver, whatever needed doing. The work was hard. The hours were long, but Ryan never complained. He had this way about him, people said, quiet but dependable. The kind of guy who'd drop everything to help a neighbor. who'd show up when you needed him most. His mother, Connie, handled the administrative side of things, the paperwork and finances that kept the farm running smoothly. She was the backbone of the operation in her own way, devoted to her children and grandchildren, making sure everything held together. The Coopers were a team. Ryan fell in love young, got married, and had his first son, Cole Roy. But that marriage didn't last, and eventually Ryan found himself alone again, still working the farm, still living the only life he'd ever wanted. Then he met Karina Elpers. She worked part-time at a local salon, cutting hair and chatting with clients in that easy small-town way. She seemed nice enough, and before long they were married at Zion Lutheran Church in Dessart, making promises in front of family and friends. Together, Ryan and Karina had 3 more children. 2 sons, Cade and Cable Ryan, and a daughter, Cortland Ivan. 4 kids in all. Ryan was over the moon. He was the kind of dad who did bedtime stories even when he was bone-tired from a day in the fields, who cheered at every game, who made time. Being a father, people said, that's what Ryan lived for. More than the farm, more than anything, he lived for his kids. Life had its rhythms, the changing seasons, the planting and harvest, Friday night football games, trips to the Lake of the Ozarks with the kids for jet skiing and boat rides. Ryan was a fan of the Iowa State Cyclones, liked tossing back a Busch Light with his buddies, enjoyed snowmobiling in winter. He had this thing about keeping his equipment immaculate, customizing and accessorizing his tractors and trucks, making sure everything was spotless. Friends joked that you could always spot Ryan coming a mile away. Phone clipped to his hip, headset over his baseball cap, work boots dusty but laced tight. Then in May of 2020, the Coopers faced another devastating loss. Connie, the family matriarch, passed away at 70 years old. Ryan took it hard. Everyone did. She'd been such a central figure in their lives. And suddenly there was this hole that couldn't be filled. But Ryan kept going, kept working, kept showing up for his kids. That's what you did. You kept going. That fall in September of 2020, something shifted in Ryan's marriage. He removed Karina from the family business phone plan. It seems like a small thing, maybe, but in a marriage, these little decisions speak volumes. There was a growing distance between them, a distrust creeping in. Ryan had seen something on Karina's phone that bothered him. A notification from someone named Houston Danker, one of her salon clients. The message was inappropriate, referencing a married woman, mentioning that he'd seen her naked. When Ryan confronted Karina about it, she'd brushed it off, said it was nothing, that Houston had meant to send it to someone else. Ryan wanted to believe her, or maybe he just didn't want to deal with it. Either way, he let it go. But something had changed, and that something was the beginning of the end. Houston Danker was 19 years younger than Karina Cooper. He was 27 when he started coming to her salon, and somewhere along the way their relationship became something more than stylist and client. They connected on Snapchat, that app where messages disappear, where conversations can be hidden, where secrets feel safer somehow. The messages started innocently enough. Maybe. But they didn't stay that way. Karina and Houston began talking more and more, fantasizing about a life together, about getting married, about having children through IVF. They exchanged thousands of messages over the months. Karina told him she hated Ryan. She called her husband a sperm donor. She said she wished he would die, wished a semi-truck would hit him, anything to get him out of the picture. No survivors, she wrote. It's chilling to read those words now, knowing what happened. But at the time, maybe it felt like fantasy to her, like venting, like words that couldn't hurt anyone because they were just words, disappearing into the digital ether. Except they weren't just words. Because Houston was listening, and Houston was willing to help. According to later testimony, Karina and Houston's relationship became physical at least once, in February of 2021. Afterward, Karina said she felt guilty, said she ended the physical side of things. But the messages continued. The planning continued, because by then they'd moved from fantasy to something darker. They'd started talking about how to actually make it happen, how to kill Ryan Cooper and get away with it. Houston's Google search history would later reveal the depths of their planning. He searched for things like best ways to kill somebody with no way for anybody to find out who did it. and how to positively get away with murder and how to delete Snapchat data. He was researching. He was serious. And Karina, she had a motive beyond just wanting Ryan gone. Ryan had life insurance policies, more than $500,000 worth, and Karina was the sole beneficiary, $515,000 to be exact. Enough to start over, enough to build that fantasy life she'd been texting about with Houston. All that stood in the way was Ryan. The night of June 17th, 2021 was unremarkable. Ryan and Karina had been with family earlier in the evening, and they came home around 8 o'clock. The kids were put to bed. The house settled into that quiet that comes after a long day. Ryan was tired. He'd been working hard, the way he always did. And at some point he fell asleep in his recliner in the living room. It wasn't unusual. After a day on the farm, sometimes you just sink into the nearest chair, and that's where you stay. That night, while Ryan slept, Houston Danker's phone pinged cell towers near the Cooper home, 3 times between 9:04 and 9:40 in the evening. His phone passed by that farmhouse like he was circling, waiting, planning. The authorities would piece this together later from phone records and cell tower data, creating a timeline that told a story Ryan would never get to defend himself against. Then in the early hours of June 18th, at 4:35 in the morning, a 911 call came in. It was Karina Cooper, and she was screaming. Someone was in the house, she said. She'd heard gunshots. She needed help. Aaron Cooper, Ryan's brother, lived just a mile down the road. Karina had called him first, before even calling 911, crying hysterical, begging him to come. Aaron called the emergency line and then rushed to his brother's house. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. Ryan was in his recliner, blood everywhere, 2 gunshot wounds to the left side of his face. Both shots had been fired at close range. You could tell from the stippling, the little burn marks around the wounds where gunpowder had touched skin. And Karina, she was sitting on top of Ryan's body, covered in his blood, sobbing uncontrollably. The scene was chaos. Blood pooled on the floor, spattered on the walls. But here's the thing that struck the first responders right away. There was no sign of forced entry. None of the doors had been jimmied open. No windows broken. Nothing stolen. The 3 children, sleeping upstairs, were completely unharmed, hadn't heard a thing, and there was no gun. No weapon anywhere near Ryan's body. Just a single .22 caliber shell casing on the floor nearby. One casing, but Ryan had been shot twice. Where was the second one? Where was the gun? The deputies knew immediately that something was off about this scene. It didn't look like a burglary gone wrong. It looked targeted, intentional. And the only people who'd been in that house were Karina, the kids, and Ryan himself. They questioned Karina at the scene. She was distraught, barely coherent, but she gave them her story. He'd gone to bed normally, she said. Woke up to a loud noise. Thought she heard Ryan snore once. When he didn't answer her calling his name, she turned on the lights and found him like this. Shot, bleeding, dying, or already dead. She didn't know what happened. She didn't know who could have done this. When the Iowa State Medical Examiner performed the autopsy the next day, they confirmed what everyone already knew. 2 gunshot wounds to the head, both independently fatal. No alcohol or drugs in his system. Ryan Cooper had been 42 years old. He'd been murdered while he slept in his own home, and someone had gotten away with it. For almost 3 years, the case went nowhere. The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation worked it alongside the Talma County Sheriff's Office. But there were no arrests, no charges, just a family torn apart by grief and confusion, in a community that couldn't understand how something like this could happen in their quiet little town. Ryan's sister Michelle would later talk about those years, about how the family suspected Karina almost from the beginning, but had to keep quiet, had to keep pretending, had to keep hugging her and telling her they loved her at family gatherings, because they needed to protect their relationship with Ryan's children. They had to maintain that facade so that when the truth finally came out, they wouldn't lose access to those kids. It was torture, she said, knowing what they suspected but not being able to say anything, having to watch Karina play the grieving widow while they ached with their own grief. And Karina did play that role. She collected on Ryan's life insurance policies, all of it, more than $500,000, paid out to the sole beneficiary while the investigation dragged on. She continued living in Traer, raising the kids, going about her life. Some people in town sympathized with her, thought she'd been through something terrible. Others had their doubts. Small towns are like that. Word gets around. But it wasn't until digital forensic experts started digging through Karina's phone records that the case finally broke open. They recovered those Snapchat messages, the ones Karina thought had disappeared forever. Thousands of them. Messages between Karina and Houston Danker planning Ryan's murder, fantasizing about their life together afterward, talking about the life insurance money, about how they'd finally be free. 4 days after Ryan's death, someone had remotely deleted Karina's Snapchat account, even though her phone had already been seized by police. The digital footprints are harder to erase than people think. The investigators kept digging, kept recovering data, kept building their case, and then there were the messages from the night of the murder itself. Around 3:30 in the morning, about an hour before Karina called 911, Houston sent her a text. "Remember those casings? No ifs, ands, or buts." Karina replied, "Absolutely. 100%. Those messages were damning. They showed premeditation, planning, coordination. They showed that both Karina and Houston knew exactly what was about to happen, and they were worried about leaving evidence behind. The shell casings, the physical proof that someone had fired a gun in that house." In February of 2024, nearly 3 years after Ryan's death, Karina Cooper was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The news rippled through Traer like a stone dropped in still water. Some people were shocked. Others nodded knowingly. Ryan's family felt something like relief mixed with devastation. Finally, someone was being held accountable. 2 months later, in April, Houston Danker was also arrested, charged with first-degree murder for acting in concert with Karina. He'd been the one circling the house that night. He'd been the one helping plan it all. The prosecution believed that either Houston had pulled the trigger while Karina helped, or Karina had done it herself while Houston waited nearby. Either way, under Iowa law, both of them were equally guilty. When detectives first questioned Houston back in 2021, right after the murder, he'd claimed he barely knew Karina, said he was her gay best friend from the salon. Nothing romantic between them. But the recovered messages told a completely different story. They showed a sexual relationship, love confessions, detailed plans for a future together. Houston had lied. And now, years later, those lies were catching up with him. Karina's trial began in July of 2025. It had been moved from Tama County to Lynn County because of all the pre-trial publicity. Everyone in Traer knew about the case, had opinions about it. A fair trial there would have been nearly impossible. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. They presented the digital evidence, those thousands of Snapchat messages. They showed the jury Karina's bank records, how her accounts had been repeatedly overdrawn in the months before Ryan's death. They brought in the insurance agent to confirm that Karina was the sole beneficiary on those policies. They presented cell tower data showing Houston's phone near the Cooper house the night of the murder. A bloodstain analyst testified that Ryan had been shot while reclined, that he'd never moved afterward, that the blood spatter patterns showed the living room door had been closed during the shooting, then opened while the blood was still wet, leaving distinct patterns that told a story of timing, of someone manipulating the scene. The medical examiner explained how both wounds were fatal, fired at close range while Ryan slept, how he wouldn't have known what was happening, how it would have been quick at least. The prosecution argued that there were two possible scenarios. Either Karina had shot Ryan herself, or Houston had done it while Karina aided and abetted. But under Iowa law, it didn't matter who pulled the trigger. If they'd planned it together, if they'd acted in concert, they were both guilty of first-degree murder. The defense tried to argue that Houston had acted alone, that he'd been manipulative, that Karina had been pulled into his fantasy without really understanding what was going to happen. They painted Houston as the mastermind and Karina as a victim of his manipulation. But those messages, they were hard to explain away. "I hate him. I wish he would die. Remember those casings?" Absolutely. 100%. Those weren't the words of someone who'd been tricked. Those were the words of someone who knew exactly what was happening and wanted it to happen. Karina took the stand in her own defense, which is always a gamble. She claimed that Houston had killed Ryan, that she hadn't known he was going to do it, that she'd been too scared of Houston to tell the police about his involvement. But under cross-examination, her story fell apart. The timeline didn't make sense. Her explanations for the messages didn't hold up. After 6 days of testimony and more than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury came back with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Karina Cooper sat at the defense table as the verdict was read, her face expressionless. Behind her, Ryan's family held each other, tears streaming down their faces. It wasn't joy exactly. It was something more complicated than that. Relief, maybe. Validation. The knowledge that Ryan's death hadn't been in vain, that someone was finally being held accountable. In August, just before his own trial was set to begin, Houston Danker changed his plea to guilty. Maybe his lawyers had told him the evidence was overwhelming. Maybe he'd watched Karina's trial and knew he didn't stand a chance. Or maybe, after all that time, something in his conscience finally cracked. He admitted to the judge that he and Karina had been lovers, that they'd planned the murder together over 4 to 5 months, that he'd helped kill Ryan Cooper. The sentencing hearings came in September and October of 2025, more than 4 years after Ryan's death. For first-degree murder in Iowa, there's only one sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. But before the judge handed down that mandatory sentence, Ryan's family got to speak. Michelle Wilson, Ryan's sister, stood at the witness stand and looked directly at Karina. Her statement was powerful, raw, pulling no punches. She talked about how, from almost the very beginning, the family had known Karina was involved, but had to keep quiet, had to live behind a facade while investigators built an airtight case. She talked about the torture of that, the having to hug Karina and smile and pretend while knowing what she'd done. She talked about Ryan, about the little brother she'd loved, the man who'd been 10 years younger than her, who'd grown up following their dad around the farm, who'd been so proud to carry on the Cooper legacy. She talked about how Ryan had been devoted to his children, how they'd been his whole world, about how Karina had robbed those children of not just their father, but in a way their mother too, since she'd be spending the rest of her life in prison. "You sentenced Ryan to death," Michelle said, her voice steady despite the tears. "And you sentenced the rest of us to life without Ryan. There is no justice. There will be no forgiveness. What I hope for now is simply closure." She ended her statement by looking Karina directly in the eye and saying, "Go to hell." Heather Cooper, Ryan's sister-in-law and Aaron's wife, also spoke. She talked about how Ryan's children now lived with her and Aaron, how they were raising them alongside their own kids, trying to give them all the love and support Ryan would have given them himself. But she acknowledged that she was no substitute for their father. No one could be. The judge, when he finally spoke, called Ryan's death a senseless crime. He told Karina that her actions had deprived her children of not only their father, but also their mother, that the ripples of what she'd done would spread through generations, affecting people who hadn't even been born yet. Karina Cooper was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She's currently incarcerated at the Iowa Correctional Institution for Women in Mitchellville, where she'll remain for the rest of her natural life. She's 48 years old now. She'll never be free again. Houston Danker received the same sentence at his hearing in October. He didn't make a statement, didn't try to explain himself or apologize. What could he say? That he was sorry? That he wished he'd made different choices? Words like that feel hollow in the face of what he'd done. Michelle Wilson spoke at his sentencing too. She told Houston that he'd tried to steal Ryan's life, Ryan's children, Ryan's dream of a farming legacy, but that he could never be Ryan, that he'd failed at that just as thoroughly as he'd failed at getting away with murder. If she would have just remembered those casings. Michelle said with bitter irony, or if he would have known to make his Google searches private. So many mistakes they made. But those are the things you learn when you kill somebody. Ryan's children are being raised by Aaron and Heather now, surrounded by family, growing up on the same land their father loved, learning about him through stories and photographs, and the way people's voices soften when they say his name. The Cooper family started a foundation in Ryan's honor, the Ryan Cooper Family Foundation, dedicated to helping families going through hard times, just like Ryan would have done himself. Every year on Father's Day, the anniversary of Ryan's death, the family gathers to remember him. They talk about the good times, the jokes he used to make, the way he'd light up when his kids accomplished something, They're determined to make sure Ryan's children know who their father really was. Not just the victim in a crime story, but the man who loved farming and his kids and cold bush shakes, and snowmobiling and customizing his tractors until they shined. The town of Traer, population 1600, is still processing what happened. How something like this could occur in their quiet community, where everyone knows everyone, where your neighbors are the people you've known since kindergarten. Some people drive by the Cooper farm and feel a chill. Others make a point of stopping by to check on Aaron, to ask about the kids, to remind the family that they're not alone. The cornfields still stretch to the horizon. The seasons still change. The farm still operates, though now it's Aaron running things, carrying on that legacy that started with his great-grandfather, working land that has Cooper blood and sweat and tears mixed into the soil. And somewhere in all of that, Ryan's memory persists. Not as the man who was murdered, not primarily as the victim in a true crime story, but as the father, the brother, the son, the friend, the neighbor who'd drop everything to help when someone needed it. The man who lived quietly and loved deeply and died too soon at the hands of people he should have been able to trust. His sister Michelle said it best at that sentencing hearing. "We will never stop saying Ryan's name." And they haven't. They won't, because that's what you do when you love someone. You keep saying their name. You keep telling their story. You make sure that whatever darkness tried to swallow them up, it doesn't get to define who they were. Ryan Roy Cooper was born on June 1st, 1979. He died on June 18th, 2021 at 42 years old. In between those dates, he lived a life that mattered. He was a son who made his parents proud, a brother who was loved fiercely, a father who lived for his children, a farmer who worked land his ancestors had worked before him, a neighbor who showed up when people needed help, a friend who was loyal and true. That's who Ryan Cooper was. That's what we remember. That's the story that matters. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolded in the quiet neighborhoods of San Francisco. A tale of friendship twisted into something darker, of choices made in moments that can never be taken back. This is a story that asks us to consider the fragile nature of trust, and the shadows that can exist behind even the most familiar faces. Take a deep breath, if you'd like, and let's begin. Our story centers on a young man named Alex Woodworth. Born in 1992, Alex grew up in the Bay Area of California, a place known for its rolling fog, steep hills, and a culture that prided itself on acceptance and innovation. Alex was by most accounts a gentle soul. Those who knew him described a young man with a kind demeanor, someone who struggled at times but who remained open-hearted in a world that could be harsh. In his early 20s, Alex found himself navigating the complexities of young adulthood. Like many people his age, he was searching for his place in the world, trying to understand who he was and what he wanted from life. He faced challenges, as we all do, but through it all, Alex maintained connections with friends and family, people who cared about him deeply. Among his circle of friends was a man named Sean Angold. Sean was roughly the same age as Alex, and the two had known each other for some time. They moved in similar social circles in San Francisco, that sprawling city by the bay where the tech boom had created stark contrast between wealth and poverty, where Victorian houses stood alongside modern glass towers, and where people from all walks of life tried to carve out their own existence. Sean had his own struggles. He had faced difficulties with substance abuse, periods of instability, and the kind of challenges that can make life feel like an uphill battle. But in Alex, he had found someone who didn't judge, someone who extended friendship even when times were difficult. There was someone else in this story, too. Her name was Morrison Lampley, though those who knew her often called her Melissa. She was younger than Sean and Alex by several years. Born in 1997, Melissa had come from the Pacific Northwest, from Portland, Oregon, and had drifted down to the Bay Area. She and Sean had formed a relationship, the kind of intense connection that sometimes develops between people who find themselves on the margins of society. In the early months of 2016, these three lives were intertwined. Alex, Sean, and Melissa spent time together in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury neighborhood, that famous district once known as the heart of the counterculture movement in the 1960s. By 2016, the neighborhood had changed, become more gentrified, but it still attracted young people looking for community, for acceptance, for something they couldn't quite name. February in San Francisco can be cold. The fog rolls in from the Pacific Ocean, wrapping the city in a damp chill that seeps into your bones. On the night of February 25, 2016, the city was quiet in the way cities can be when darkness falls, when the tourists have retreated to their hotels and the locals have settled into their evening routines. That night, Alex Woodworth, Sean Ingold, and Morrison Lampley were together. The exact details of their evening have been pieced together through witness statements, physical evidence, and the confessions that would come later. What we know is this. At some point during that night, something went terribly, irreversibly wrong. According to the accounts that emerged, the three were in the Haight-Ashbury area. They may have been under the influence of substances. This was later suggested by various sources close to the investigation. What began as an ordinary evening among friends transformed into something violent. Sean Ingold and Morrison Lampley attacked Alex Woodworth. The assault was brutal. Alex was beaten and stabbed multiple times. The violence inflicted upon him was severe, methodical, and ultimately fatal. This young man, who had extended friendship and trust, found himself betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. The reasons behind this attack remain somewhat murky, filtered through the fog of conflicting accounts and the unreliable narratives provided by those involved. Some reports suggested that Sean and Melissa had become convinced, perhaps through paranoia or delusion enhanced by drug use, that Alex posed some kind of threat to them. Others hinted at a possible robbery motive. Still others suggested the attack may have had elements of a thrill-seeking, something darker and more disturbing than simple fear or greed. What is certain is that Alex Woodworth died that night. His life ended on a San Francisco street. His body left behind as Sean and Melissa fled the scene. He was 23 years old. When someone dies violently, there's a moment before the discovery when the world continues as normal. People walk past, cars drive by. Life moves forward, unaware that something terrible has occurred just out of sight. Alex's body was discovered in the early morning hours of February 26th. The location was in Haight-Ashbury, that neighborhood of colorful Victorian houses and busy intersections. When the police arrived, they found a scene of violence that spoke to the intensity of what had occurred. The San Francisco Police Department began their investigation immediately. Homicide detectives canvassed the area, looking for witnesses, collecting evidence, trying to piece together what had happened and who was responsible. In a city the size of San Francisco, with its population of over 800,000 people, finding suspects in a street killing could be challenging. But this case would take an unexpected turn. The medical examiner confirmed what was already apparent from the scene. Alex had died from multiple stab wounds and blunt force trauma. The attack had been sustained and vicious. This was not a crime of passion that ended after a single blow, but rather something that continued well past the point when Alex would have posed any threat. Meanwhile, Sean Ingold and Morrison Lampley had left the city. They traveled north, away from San Francisco, away from the scene of what they had done. They made their way up the coast of California, heading toward another state, perhaps believing that distance would provide safety. They went to Oregon, to the area around Portland, the city where Melissa had grown up, and there, incredibly, they would kill again. In the Fairview area, just outside Portland, there lived a young woman named Audrey Carey. She was 23 years old, the same age Alex Woodworth had been. Audrey was a traveler at heart, someone who had moved through life with a sense of adventure and openness to experience. Those who knew Audrey remembered her warmth, her intelligence, her desire to connect with others. She had spent time traveling, had lived in different places, and had eventually found herself in the Portland area. She was working at a hiking supply store, a job that suited her love of the outdoors. On March 3rd, 2016, just 6 days after Alex Woodworth's murder in San Francisco, Audrey's body was discovered in a public park in Fairview, Oregon. She had been killed in a manner strikingly similar to Alex, stabbed multiple times and beaten. The violence was once again excessive and brutal. The Fairview Police Departments and the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office launched an investigation. They collected evidence from the scene, interviewed potential witnesses, and began the painstaking work of trying to identify who was responsible for this young woman's death. What they didn't know yet, what couldn't have been immediately apparent, was that Audrey Carey's murder was connected to another killing over 600 miles to the south. The connection would become clear soon enough. When police investigate a murder, they follow the evidence wherever it leads. Sometimes that evidence points in unexpected directions. Sometimes the pieces of a puzzle fall into place quickly. And sometimes separate investigations running in parallel suddenly converge. Witnesses near the park in Fairview had seen people matching the descriptions of Sean and Melissa in the area around the time of Audrey's death. Police began to circulate these descriptions, asking the public for help in identifying potential suspects. It didn't take long. Sean Angold and Morrison Lampley were located and taken into custody in Oregon. Initially, they were questioned about Audrey Carey's murder, but as investigators dug deeper as they connected the dots between the two cases, the full scope of what had occurred began to emerge. Both Sean and Melissa eventually confessed to killing Alex Woodworth and Audrey Carey. The confessions came separately, but they aligned in the crucial details. They admitted to the violence, to the stabbings, to leaving two young people dead in the span of less than a week. The motivations they provided were vague and contradictory. At various times, they claimed they had felt threatened, that they needed money, that they had been in the grip of paranoia. Some reports suggested they had been influenced by drugs, possibly methamphetamine, which can induce psychosis and paranoia in heavy users. But ultimately, no explanation could make sense of why two lives had been taken so violently and so needlessly. The legal proceedings that followed would unfold across two states, involving multiple jurisdictions and complex questions of where and how Sean Angold and Morrison Lampley should be tried and sentenced. In the American legal system, when someone is accused of murder, they have the right to a trial, to present a defense, to have their case heard, but they also have the right to plead guilty, to accept responsibility for what they've done in exchange for a negotiated sentence. Sean Angold and Morrison Lampley both chose to plead guilty rather than go to trial. This meant that the families of Alex Woodworth and Audrey Carey would be spared the ordeal of a lengthy trial, of having to hear every detail of how their loved ones died. But it also meant that some questions might never be fully answered. In California, both defendants pleaded guilty to the murder of Alex Woodworth. The charges included first-degree murder, and the circumstances of the crime meant they faced significant prison time. The San Francisco Superior Court sentenced them to lengthy terms. In Oregon, similar proceedings took place for the murder of Audrey Carey. Again, both pleaded guilty, and again they received substantial sentences. The exact structure of their sentences was complex, involving considerations of how time would be served across different jurisdictions and whether sentences would run concurrently or consecutively. Morrison Lampley, who was 19 years old at the time of the murders, received a sentence of 26 years to life in the California case. Sean Angold, who was 24 at the time, received similar sentencing. In Oregon, additional years were added for Audrey's murder. These sentences meant that both would spend decades in prison, likely the majority of their remaining lives. They would grow old behind bars, their youth consumed by the consequences of choices made during a span of less than a week. It's important, in telling a story like this, not to let it be only about the perpetrators, about the violence and the legal proceedings. Because at the center of this story are two people who lost their lives. Two young people who had families and friends and futures that were stolen from them. Alex Woodworth was remembered by those who knew him as someone who struggled, but who kept trying. Life hadn't been easy for him, but he maintained his capacity for friendship, for connection, for kindness. His family spoke of their grief, of the hole left in their lives by his absence. In the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood where Alex died, friends and community members held vigils. They lit candles, shared memories, and mourned a life cut short. These gatherings served as a reminder that every murder victim is more than just a statistic, more than just a name in a case file. They are someone's son, someone's friend, someone who mattered. Alex's murder also highlighted ongoing concerns about safety and street crime in San Francisco, particularly issues related to drug use and homelessness in neighborhoods like the Haight. Community activists use the tragedy as a catalyst for conversations about how to better serve vulnerable populations, how to prevent violence, how to create a safer city for everyone. Audrey Carey's family and friends were devastated by her loss. She was described as vibrant, curious, and full of life. She had traveled extensively, had lived in Hawaii for a time, and had a deep love for nature and the outdoors. Her work at a hiking supply store reflected her passions. Those who knew Audrey organized memorials in her honor. They shared stories of her adventurous spirit, her laughter, her warmth. They spoke of the unfairness of her death, of how someone so young and full of potential had been taken so suddenly and so violently. Audrey's murder also raised questions in the Portland area about public safety in parks and recreational areas. The fact that she had been killed in a public space during daylight hours was particularly disturbing to many residents. It prompted discussions about park patrols, about how to balance the openness and accessibility of public spaces with the need for safety. In both cases, the families faced not only the immediate grief of loss, but also the long process of healing that follows homicide. Unlike deaths from illness or accident, murder adds layers of trauma, the knowledge of intentional violence, the legal proceedings, the media attention, the unanswerable questions about why. Even with confessions and convictions, cases like this leave us with questions. How do two people, neither of whom had previously committed murder, kill two different people in two different states in the span of 6 days? What drives that kind of violence? Some experts have suggested that substance abuse played a significant role. Methamphetamine, in particular, can produce severe paranoia, hallucinations, and a disconnect from reality. Heavy users can experience what's sometimes called meth psychosis, a state in which they genuinely believe they are in danger, or that others are threatening them. Could this explain the claims that Sean and Melissa felt threatened by Alex? Perhaps, though it doesn't explain all aspects of the crimes. Others have pointed to the phenomenon of folie à deux, a French term meaning madness of two, in which a delusion or mental illness is shared between two people in close relationship. In such cases, one person's paranoia or disturbed thinking can be adopted by another, creating a feedback loop that reinforces and amplifies irrational beliefs. The intense relationship between Sean and Melissa, combined with isolation and possible substance use, might have created conditions for this kind of shared disturbance. There's also the uncomfortable question of whether these crimes had an element of thrill-seeking to them. Some evidence suggested that the violence went beyond what would be necessary for robbery or self-defense, that there was an excess to it that hinted at something darker. This is difficult territory to navigate because it forces us to confront the capacity for cruelty that exists in human nature. Whatever the explanations, two people are dead who should still be alive. Two families are forever changed, and two perpetrators will spend the rest of their lives in prison, their own futures extinguished by their own actions. Cases like the murders of Alex Woodworth and Audrey Carey force us to think about larger questions. We live in a society where substance abuse, mental illness, and homelessness create vulnerable populations. Both victims and perpetrators in this case were, in different ways, part of these vulnerable groups. What systems failed that might have prevented these deaths? Were there intervention points that were missed? Should there have been more resources available for people struggling with addiction and mental health issues? These are the kinds of questions that policymakers and community leaders grapple with in the aftermath of tragedies like this. There's also the question of how we think about justice. Lengthy prison sentences serve multiple purposes. They punish the offenders. They protect society by removing dangerous individuals from the community. And they provide some sense of justice to the victims' families. But do they address the root causes of violence? Do they heal the harm that's been done? These are questions without easy answers. The kind of questions that people of good faith can disagree about. What's certain is that the lives lost cannot be recovered, and that the ripples of these murders continue to spread outward, touching everyone connected to the case. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, let me tell you a story. one that happened on the very first day of a brand new year, in a small California town where everyone knew everyone. It's a story about trust, about kindness turned tragic, and about how sometimes the people we think we know best can surprise us in the darkest ways. And this is the story of Valerie Zavala Wilson. There's something peaceful about Fillmore, California. It's one of those small towns tucked into Ventura County, surrounded by citrus groves and mountains, where the air smells like orange blossoms in the spring. The kind of place where neighbors wave to each other, where high school football games bring out the whole community, where you can walk down the street at night and feel safe. In the early 2000s, Fillmore was home to about 13,000 people. It was the kind of town where families put down roots for generations, where kids grew up knowing they'd probably see their kindergarten classmates at their high school graduation. And among those families were the Zavalas, who had moved to Fillmore so their children could grow up in exactly this kind of community. Valerie Diane Zavala Wilson was born on August 20th, 1983, in Santa Clara, California. She came into the world as the eldest daughter of Kevin and Michelle Zavala, joining what would eventually become a family of 4 children. Her parents called her their bundle of joy, and by all accounts, that's exactly what she was. Valerie had 2 younger sisters, Jessica and Kirsten, and a younger brother named Kevin. The family was close-knit, the kind where the kids actually wanted to spend time together, where movie nights and inside jokes were common. When the family moved to Fillmore, Valerie was still young enough that it became her hometown, the place that shaped who she would become, and who she became was someone special. Not just in the way that grieving parents always remember their children as special, but genuinely, measurably special, the kind of person who left an impression on everyone she met. At Fillmore High School, Valerie wasn't just another student. She excelled academically, earning good grades that reflected genuine intellectual curiosity rather than mere grade grubbing. She was a cheerleader, one of those bright, energetic presences on the sidelines, who seemed to embody school spirit itself. But she wasn't content to just cheer. She volunteered to compile statistics for the wrestling team, earning herself a sports letter in the process. Think about that for a moment. How many teenagers voluntarily take on extra work just to be helpful, just to be part of something? Her friends described her as bubbly, vibrant, outgoing, someone with a contagious laugh that could light up a room. Her father, Kevin Wilson, would later say that she was trusting, almost to a fault. When she felt a certain way about a decision, nothing would stop her. He remembered, she wasn't one to follow the crowd. Her mother, Michelle, had an even closer relationship with her eldest daughter. She was not only my daughter, she was my best friend. Michelle would tell reporters later, her voice breaking, "On girls' night out, we watched Julia Roberts movies and ate Doritos and avocados." Can you picture it? A mother and daughter sitting together on a couch, the glow of the television illuminating their faces, sharing snacks and laughter. Those simple, perfect moments that make up a relationship. The kind of moments that, in hindsight, become almost unbearably precious. Valerie graduated from Fillmore High School with honors. She had dreams of becoming an elementary school teacher, of shaping young minds the way her own had been shaped by caring educators. She wanted to give back, to make a difference, and so she enrolled at San Jose State University, about 270 miles north of Fillmore, to pursue her degree in liberal arts. At San Jose State, Valerie joined the Alpha Kappa Delta Phi sorority. She wasn't just a member. She threw herself into it the way she threw herself into everything, becoming the fundraising chairwoman. Her sorority sisters nicknamed her Chug-a-Bug, one of those affectionate nicknames that only make sense to the people who knew her. She was the kind of person people confided in, the one you'd go to with your problems because you knew she'd listen, really listen, and try to help. By the end of 2002, Valerie was 19 years old and a sophomore in college. She was home for the winter break, back in Fillmore for the holidays. Christmas had come and gone, and now it was New Year's Eve. That strange in-between time when one year is ending and another is about to begin. A time of parties and nalas, of resolutions and fresh starts. Valerie had been invited to a New Year's Eve party at a friend's house in Fillmore. It was the kind of party that small-town teenagers throw. Nothing too wild. Just friends gathering to ring in the new year together. She went with her cousin, Robert Padilla, and her friend Anna Hinojosa. Video footage from the party would later show Valerie in the kitchen, smiling, laughing, in good spirits. She was the designated driver that night, the responsible one, the one making sure everyone got home safely. The party had started around 10 in the evening, and as the hours ticked by and the new year approached, people started to get tired, started to think about heading home. Around 1 in the morning, shortly after the ball had dropped, and 2003 had officially begun, Valerie checked in with her parents. She told them that Anna had been drinking, so she was going to drive Anna home in Anna's car. She also mentioned that she'd be giving a ride to someone else, a 17-year-old named Samuel Puebla. Samuel Puebla, everyone called him Sammy. He was a classmate of Valerie's younger sister, 2 years behind Valerie at Fillmore High School. He was a senior, a football player, popular among his peers. In fact, he'd recently been voted prom king, that quintessentially all-American high school honor that speaks to being well-liked, well-regarded. He was a straight-A student, the kind of kid that adults pointed to as an example of doing things right. On the surface, Sammy Puebla had everything going for him, but beneath that surface, things were darker than anyone knew. That night, after the party, Valerie got behind the wheel of Anna's black 2003 Toyota Corolla. Anna was in the car, and so was Sammy Puebla. The plan was simple: drop Anna off first, then drop Sammy off, and then Valerie was planning to visit an ex-boyfriend named Isaac Flores before heading home herself. Around 2 in the morning, after dropping Anna off, Valerie and Sammy were alone in the car, driving through the quiet streets of Fillmore. Most of the town was asleep by then. The party's over, the celebration's winding down. It was dark, that particular darkness of a small town in the early morning hours, where streetlights are few and far between. What happened next would only be pieced together later, through physical evidence and changing stories and the kind of detective work that involves fitting together puzzle pieces that don't want to fit. At some point during that drive, Samuel Puebla made unwanted advances toward Valerie. The exact words spoken, the exact sequence of events. These details were lost in the darkness of that night, but what is known is that Valerie rejected him. She said no, and for Sammy Puebla, that rejection triggered something violent. He attacked her in the car. He put his hands around her throat and began to strangle her, to choke her until she lost consciousness. But he didn't squeeze hard enough or long enough. Valerie came to, and when she did, she realized the danger she was in. She managed to escape from the car. She ran. Think about that moment. The terror of waking up to find yourself in mortal danger. The adrenaline that must have flooded her system. The desperate need to get away, to survive, to make it to help, to make it home. She ran through the dark streets of Fillmore, this town where she'd grown up, where she'd walked 1,000 times in daylight, now transformed into a nightmare landscape. And Sammy Puebla chased her. He caught up with her in the parking lot of St. Francis of Assisi Church, the same church where her family attended services, where she'd been a regular presence her whole life. In that parking lot, he attacked her again. He struck her in the head with such force that her eardrum ruptured. Her earring flew off and landed on the pavement. He ripped off her clothing. He attempted to rape her. But she fought back. She fought with everything she had. The medical examiner would later find defensive wounds, evidence that Valerie Zavala Wilson did not go quietly into the dark. She struggled. She resisted. She fought for her life. But Samuel Puebla was stronger, and he was driven by something dark and inexplicable. He struck her repeatedly in the head, causing severe trauma, and then he put his hands around her throat again and strangled her, this time leaning his weight on her chest as he did so, making it impossible for her to breathe, impossible for her to fight back, until finally her struggle ended. She died there in that church parking lot, in the early hours of New Year's Day, 2003, the first day of a year that should have held so much promise for her. A year of college classes and sorority events, and dreams of teaching. A year that she would never see. After Valerie was dead, Samuel Puebla gathered up her clothing, her belongings, the physical evidence of what he'd done. He put her body in the car and drove to a remote area off South Mountain Road. Between the towns of Santa Pola and Fillmore, there was a drainage culvert there, a concrete pipe that carried rainwater. It was isolated, surrounded by citrus groves, the kind of place where you wouldn't expect to find anyone. He dumped her body in that culvert, partially covering it with cypress branches, perhaps thinking that would hide it, would buy him time. Then he left her there in the cold darkness and drove away in Anna's car. The next morning, January 1st, 2003, a young boy was taking a shortcut from his home when he came across something that would haunt him forever. A body in the drainage pipe. Even from a distance, he could tell something was terribly wrong. He ran home and his family called 911. When the Ventura County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene, they found Valerie Zavala Wilson's partially nude body in the culvert. Her shirt had been pulled up. Her pants and underwear were missing. She was covered with cypress branches. She wore only one ear. Blood was oozing from her ear, and it wasn't fully dried yet, a sign that she hadn't been there very long. The deputies processed the scene carefully. They found shoe prints. They found evidence that suggested the body had been dragged. That this wasn't where she'd been killed. They took photographs, collected samples, documented everything. And they began the grim work of trying to figure out who this young woman was and what had happened to her. By that evening, Valerie's family had reported her missing. She hadn't come home. She wasn't answering her phone. In a small town like Fillmore, word travels fast. And when the description of the body was shared, her family's worst fears were confirmed. It was Valerie. The autopsy revealed that she had died from asphyxiation, from being strangled. She'd also suffered blunt force trauma to her head. The manner of death was ruled a homicide, and with that determination, a murder investigation began. The detectives, led by Jose Rivera and Chris Dunn, started by retracing Valerie's last known movements. They learned about the New Year's Eve party. They learned that she'd been the designated driver. They learned about the passengers she'd agreed to drop off. Ana Hinojosa and Samuel Puebla. They found Anna's car on the afternoon of January 1st, parked in a grocery store lot in Fillmore. Inside, they found Valerie's purse, her blouse, her jacket. The car became a crime scene, carefully processed for evidence. The detectives interviewed Anna, who told them about the party, about how Valerie had been kind enough to drive her home since she'd been drinking. They asked about Samuel Puebla, and Anna confirmed that yes, he'd been in the car too. When the detectives reached out to Sammy Puebla, he agreed to talk to them. This was just hours after the body had been found, before it had even been publicly identified as Valerie. Deputy Tilkins went to Sammy's house to ask him some questions. Tilkins would later testify about that encounter. He said Sammy seemed nervous. His voice kept cracking, and he had a nosebleed which he was trying to stop with tissues. The deputy asked him about the last time he'd seen Valerie. Sammy said yes, he'd been at the party. Yes, Valerie had given him a ride home. He said they'd hugged briefly when she dropped him off. And that was the last time he saw her. The detectives also learned that Valerie had been planning to visit her ex-boyfriend Isaac Flores after dropping off her passengers. Isaac initially became a person of interest. The detectives interviewed him, asked him about his relationship with Valerie, about whether he'd seen her that night. Isaac told them that yes, they'd had plans to meet, but she never showed up. He'd been waiting for her, wondering where she was. And crucially, he had an alibi. There was no evidence linking him to the crime. The investigation seemed to stall. There were shoe prints at the scene, but no one to match them to. There was DNA evidence, but the labs took time to process. A week went by, and the case grew cold. But then, something interesting happened. A witness came forward. A couple who had been driving home from their own New Year's Eve party in the early morning hours of January 1st. Reported seeing something unusual. They'd seen a person standing next to a black sedan, Anna's black sedan, parked at a market in Fillmore. The person matched Sammy Puebla's description. Around the same time, one of the detectives who'd been on vacation returned to duty. His name was Detective Eab, and when he was briefed on the case, something clicked in his mind. He remembered Samuel Puebla. Not from this case, but from a previous one. Just a few weeks earlier, in December, there had been a burglary. Samuel Puebla had been involved in it. During the investigation of that burglary, Puebla had told detectives that he'd dumped items he didn't want in a dumpster at St. Francis of Assisi Church, the same church where Valerie's family worshipped. The same church, it would turn out, where Valerie had been killed. Detective Ayub had a theory. Criminals, he knew, tend to stick to patterns. They do what's worked for them in the past, what feels comfortable and familiar. If Puebla had used that church dumpster to dispose of evidence once, might he have done it again? On January 7th, Exactly 1 week after Valerie's body had been found, detectives obtained a warrant and headed to St. Francis of Assisi Church. They'd received another piece of tragic timing. Valerie's rosary service had been held at that church just hours before. The family and friends who'd gathered to mourn her had no idea that they were standing mere feet from where she'd been murdered, where crucial evidence still lay waiting to be discovered, in the church parking lot and in the dumpster. Detectives found a horrifying collection of items. There were cypress clippings, matching the branches that had been used to cover Valerie's body. There was a pair of women's underwear. There was an earring that looked just like the one Valerie had still been wearing when her body was found. And there were shoe prints in the dirt, clear impressions left behind. DNA testing would confirm what the detectives suspected. The underwear and earring belonged to Valerie Zavala Wilson. The shoe prints matched a pair of sneakers owned by Samuel Puebla, and when the DNA results came back from Valerie's body, they revealed something else. There was saliva on her chest. Male saliva. And it matched Samuel Puebla's DNA profile. With this evidence in hand, detectives obtained a warrant to search Puebla's home and to collect a DNA sample from him directly. On January 7th, they arrived at his house. What they found in Samuel Puebla's bedroom was deeply disturbing. Hidden away, they discovered stashes of women's underwear and cell phones. The underwear had been stolen from women in the neighborhood. They were trophies, keepsakes, evidence of a pattern of behavior that had gone unnoticed. Samuel Puebla, the straight-A student, the prom king, the football player, had been secretly violating the privacy and safety of women around him for who knows how long. When the detectives interviewed Sammy again, they confronted him with the evidence. They told him about the DNA, about the possibility that his genetic material had been found on Valerie's body. At this point, Sammy changed his story. First, he'd said they'd just hugged. Now he claimed that he and Valerie had been kissing, that they'd been planning to engage in consensual sexual activity. But the evidence told a different story. The detectives asked Sammy if he was cold. He said yes. So Detective Ayub went to his closet and found a jacket. A specific jacket that matched the description witnesses had given of what Sammy had been wearing at the party. The jacket was seized as evidence. Lab analysis would prove that Valerie's blood was on that jacket. Her blood, physical proof that Samuel Puebla had been there when she died, that he'd been close enough to her bleeding body to get her blood on his clothing. The arrest of Samuel Puebla sent shockwaves through Fillmore. This was the prom king. This was a kid who seemed to have it all together. How could he have done something so monstrous? His family and friends couldn't believe it. They said there must be some mistake, that Sammy was a good kid, that this couldn't be true, but the evidence was overwhelming. The DNA, the blood, the shoe prints, the pattern of theft and violation that had been hidden in his bedroom, and most damning of all, his constantly changing story. Each version shifting to try to account for whatever new evidence the detectives presented. Samuel Puebla was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, attempted rape, and the special circumstance of felony murder committed during the course of an attempted sexual assault. The trial began on July 9th, 2004, about a year and a half after Valerie's death. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Maeve Fox, laid out their case methodically. They argued that Samuel Puebla had made unwanted sexual advances toward Valerie during that drive home. When she rejected him, when she said no, he became violent. They theorized that he'd attacked her in the car, that she'd managed to escape and run, and that he'd chased her down and killed her in that church parking lot. Then he disposed of her body in the drainage culvert and tried to cover his tracks. The defense attorneys tried their best. They suggested that maybe someone else had killed Valerie. Some unknown stranger. They pointed to a witness who'd reported seeing a man near where the body was found. Someone who didn't match Puebla's description. They tried to create reasonable doubt, but the physical evidence was insurmountable. Valerie's blood on Puebla's jacket, his saliva on her body, his shoe prints at the scene, his items in the church dumpster, his stolen trophies hidden in his bedroom, and his ever-changing story, each version more desperate than the last. The jury deliberated. According to later interviews, there was little disagreement among them. The evidence was simply too strong. On August 2nd, 2004, they returned with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. first-degree murder, attempted rape, felony murder during the commission of attempted sexual assault. Because Samuel Puebla had been 17 at the time of the murder, he was ineligible for the death penalty, but he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At the sentencing hearing, Valerie's family members addressed the court. They urged the judge to ensure that Samuel Puebla would never be released, that he would never have the opportunity to hurt another young woman the way he'd hurt Valerie. Michelle Wilson, Valerie's mother, spoke about her daughter, about the light that had been extinguished, about the future that had been stolen. Kevin Wilson, her father, echoed those sentiments. But even in their grief and anger, the Wilsons showed remarkable compassion. Michelle Wilson told reporters that she felt empathy for Samuel Puebla's family, his parents, his siblings. They were victims too, in a way, she acknowledged. Their journey was just beginning, she said. The journey of having to live with what their son and brother had done. But her family, Valerie's family, could at least begin to heal now. The prosecutor, Maeve Fox, told the press that the case was particularly awful because Valerie had no reason to be afraid of Samuel Puebla before he reached his breaking point. He was her sister's classmate. He was a familiar face, someone from their small community. She'd been doing him a favor, giving him a ride home. She'd been being kind, being helpful, being the responsible designated driver. And he'd repaid that kindness with violence and murder. Samuel Puebla was transferred to state prison. As of the latest reports, he's incarcerated at Ironwood State Prison in California, where he's serving his life sentence. Some sources suggest he may become eligible for parole in 2028, though given the severity of his crimes and the life without parole sentence, that seems unlikely. Valerie Zavala Wilson was laid to rest at Bardsdale Cemetery in Fillmore, not far from where she'd grown up, where she'd cheered at football games, where she'd walked to school, where she'd lived her brief, bright life. Her funeral was packed with mourners. Her sorority sisters from San Jose State drove down for the service. The walls of St. Francis of Assisi Church were lined with people who'd come to pay their respects, to say goodbye. Her little brother, Kevin, pressed his lips to a red rose and placed it on her silver casket, then kissed the coffin goodbye. Michelle Wilson released a dove at the burial, a symbol of peace, of Valerie's spirit ascending. The principal at Fillmore High School made grief counselors available for students, especially for Valerie's younger sisters who still attended the school. On the San Jose State campus, their sorority held a candlelight vigil. The sorority's website was flooded with messages from all over the country, from people who'd known Valerie or who'd simply been moved by her story. "I am still in shock," wrote a Sacramento sorority sister named Kim. "I cannot believe it. Valerie was such a wonderful person. She was beautiful inside and out. She always brought smiles and laughs to my face." That's what people remembered about Valerie. Not the way she died, though. That was what made headlines. What brought her case to true crime documentaries and television shows. What people who actually knew her remembered was her smile, her laugh, her kindness, the way she volunteered to be the designated driver, the way she helped out with the wrestling team statistics, the way she made time for her sorority sisters and her family, the way she lit up a room just by walking into it. She wanted to be a teacher. She wanted to shape young minds, to make a difference in children's lives. And in a way, maybe she still does. Because her story teaches something important, something difficult but necessary. It teaches us that evil can hide behind a smile, behind good grades and prom king crowns and football jerseys. It teaches us that trust, while necessary for human connection, needs to be tempered with awareness and caution. It teaches us that even in small towns where everyone knows everyone, terrible things can happen in the darkness. But perhaps more than that, Valerie's story teaches us about the preciousness of life, about how quickly everything can change, about how a simple act of kindness, giving someone a ride home, can have unforeseeable consequences. It reminds us to cherish the people we love, to watch Julia Roberts movies and eat Doritos and avocados with our mothers, to make memories while we can. Fillmore, California, changed after that New Year's Day in 2003. The town lost some of its innocence. Parents held their children a little tighter. Young women were more cautious about giving rides to acquaintances. The community that had seemed so safe suddenly felt more vulnerable. But Fillmore also came together in the wake of tragedy. They supported the Wilson family. They showed up at the trial. They made sure that Valerie was remembered not just as a victim, but as the vibrant, loving, ambitious young woman she'd been. On the night of December 31st, 2002, Valerie Zavala Wilson went to a party with friends. She laughed, she celebrated, she welcomed the new year. She made the responsible choice to be the designated driver. She offered kindness to someone who asked for a ride. And for those choices, for that kindness, she paid with her life. It's been over 2 decades now since that terrible night. Valerie would be in her early 40s if she'd lived. She might have become that elementary school teacher she dreamed of being. She might have had a classroom full of students who adored her, who remembered her years later as the teacher who made learning fun, who believed in them. She might have gotten married, had children of her own. She might have grown old with her parents, watched her siblings' children grow up, then the fun at family gatherings. All of those might-have-beens were stolen by a few minutes of violence in a dark parking lot, by one person's inability to accept rejection, to control their impulses, to see another human being as anything more than an object for their own gratification. Samuel Puebla is in prison, and he'll likely stay there for the rest of his life. That's justice of a sort. It protects society from him. It punishes him for what he did. But it doesn't bring Valerie back. It doesn't give Michelle and Kevin their daughter back. It doesn't give Jessica and Kirsten their big sister back. It doesn't give young Kevin his sister back. It doesn't give Valerie's friends and sorority sisters their friend back. And it doesn't give all those future elementary school students the teacher they never got to have. That's the real tragedy of murder, isn't it? It's not just one life that ends. It's all the lives that life would have touched. It's the ripple effects, spreading out endlessly through time. It's the hole left behind in the world, shaped exactly like the person who's gone. On quiet nights in Fillmore, when the citrus blossoms are blooming and the mountains are dark silhouettes against the sky, maybe some people still think about Valerie. Maybe they remember her laugh. Maybe they remember her cheering at football games. Maybe they remember her as that girl who was always willing to help, always willing to volunteer, always there with a smile. And maybe, in remembering her that way, in keeping alive the memory of who she was rather than just how she died, there's a different kind of justice. A way of saying that Samuel Puebla might have taken her life, but he couldn't take her impact, couldn't erase the love she gave and received, couldn't destroy the mark she left on the world in her 19 years. Rest in peace, Valerie Diane Zavala Wilson. August 20th, 1983 to January 1st, 2003. A daughter, a sister, a friend, a student, a cheerleader, a dreamer, gone far too soon, but never forgotten. And that's the story. A true story. A sad story. But one worth telling, worth remembering. Because in the telling, Valerie lives on, just a little bit. And maybe that mattered. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.